And also thank you for being here. Actually, it was not so difficult in retrospect to work smartly in Moscow as a stranger. First, because as a stranger you are in the privileged position to ask the wrong questions. And second, because this was indeed a moment with a highly sophisticated art scene. And I'm glad, to be among some of the elder, so to speak, but also to see so many young faces. I never wanted to become a curator. I'm strongly against this kind of job description, because I think, and this is something I just discussed with Victor, that exhibition making has to do with an agenda. It's not something that you do like a baker every day or every night, but to have an idea doesn't happen all the time. For some people it never happens. And for others it's maybe 2 or 3 things that are really worth exploring. So to make an exhibition in order to find something out, rather than making a statement, involves a different way of dealing with artists and audiences, but also in working with space and things we are used to call artworks. By now, as you have heard, I have become a director. But this institution, which I basically set up myself with the help of a private foundation, is not a big institution. It's tiny. It's probably the tiniest museum on the planet. So our exhibition space is around 100 square meters. So half of this room. It's more a kind of laboratory. Also, I don't like the scientific connotations of laboratory, because what I'm doing is not clean. It's again an attempt to ask the wrong questions, but this time protected by an institution. Things have changed in the last 20 or 30 years or so. To have a precarious position as a sort of avant-garde curator, even against your own will, seemed attractive at a point. But it's also exhausting. It kills people in the long run, spiritually as well as physically. This has to do with changes that have affected the art world, which has become now a kind of global industrial complex. What was once important in aesthetic experience, and what is commonly referred to as a philosophical term as negativity, which means a kind of inherent contradiction in your modes of perception has vanished, or so it seems. So to me, today, the art world seems basically like a kind of fashion business, and it pleases audiences with a vengeance. But there's also no law that decrees what once has been called art will always remain art. As you might know, the concept of art is a very local concept that has been dreamt up in Europe in the 17th and 18th century. It might as well have vanished. However, the things that are magical and intellectually challenging don't disappear. They just look for different channels. And setting up an institution could be such a different channel. So my discussion tonight will, in a way, correspond quite closely to to those ideas Victor has brought up in the context of his human condition exhibition and program. I think the key question is if it's possible, and if so, how, to extract some sense of ethics from artistic experience. But again, we have to look for where this aesthetic experience happens. It cannot be programmed. It is involuntary. And therefore contingency, or the accident, plays a major part. But which institution does allow for accidents to happen? We are reliving, or so it seems to me, the aftermath of the First World War. We have Russia pinned against Turkey. We have a whole setup of states which were artificially created in Whitehall or at the Quai d'Orsay between 1916 and 22, basically, in the Middle East, Iraq, Syria, and so on. There was a narrative of Western centrality that for a while seemed believable. And this narrative has determined the setup of institutions. On the right, you have a map which basically documents those areas which once belonged to the Ottoman Empire and have been eaten away by Allied powers, France, Britain, Russia, you name it. On the left, you have the floor plan of the British Museum. So this is probably the key encyclopedic museum. And I'm not sure if you can read all the entries in the last row. You get a sense of what's there. Assyrian ivory work, ancient Syria, mummies, Coptic art, Greek and Roman bronzes, everyday life in ancient Greece and Rome, Greek and Roman sculpture, Ephesus, Rome, portrait collection, and so on and so forth. So this museum resulted from a marvelous act of plundering. It was a project of infinite accumulation. And while it suggests some order, I mean, you can walk easily from ancient Cyprus in room 72 to Hellenistic southern Italy in room 73. The whole thing creates in your imagination a sense of madness, of overabundance. And then what happens to you as a spectator if you are faced, quite literally, by such a thing? Is this a token of property, in the same sense that the Chinese imperial collection demonstrated via objects the proprietary status of the emperor, so that if you kept a stone from this or that province, you actually owned that province. While on the one hand amassing this family of forms, encyclopedic museums were also radically shattering their context and therefore their sense of belonging. They were taken from a field of practice, which on the other hand demonstrated quite aptly the disruptive effects of colonial intervention and vampirism. I think it matters to have a sense of how and why we relate to images and objects, of why they matter to us, besides that a canonical institution, like for example the British Museum, tells us what matters. On the right you have an image that came to me through the internet by a Yazidi woman who was held captive by Islamic State. On the left you have an image of my wife. You might get an idea of the direction my argument will take. Victor called it, with Goethe, elective affinities, although Goethe took this concept from another, more scientifically in kind context. Yes, there are those elective affinities. Your imagination or your mind cannot help but draw correspondences between a hand and a hand, between a piece of dark hair and a piece of dark hair, between a certain posture. So this is a kind of wandering of the imagination that again cannot be programmed. Sometimes an object strikes you, and sometimes it leaves you cold. On the left image, you have a photograph of Palmyra, of the site that has been detonated by Islamic State, of the temple of Baal and the rubble that is left of it. On the right image, you have a wall at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. I mean, both spaces demonstrate a profound emptiness. On the left, something is gone. This is banal on the physical or material level. What it means to you is another matter. On the right, you have what amounts to be a statement about the white cube, or the way art presentation was established following certain examples in Berlin after the First World War, which have then been introduced to the Museum of Modern Art by Alfred Barr. But you also witness a profound ambiguity when it comes to this emptiness. I mean, what the white cube means or meant in conventional terms is quite clear. You had a white wall, and then on it, a painting by Malevich, or by Renoir, or Picasso sculpture in front of it, whatever. So the white wall, or the autonomy which it suggested, meant that you as a spectator were supposed to perceive this object, this thing, without any preconditions. But this kind of a world, if it ever existed, doesn't exist anymore. After conceptualism, after the demise or the failure of conceptualism, which was a productive failure, in the words of the English philosopher Peter Osborne, things have gone a little bit awry. It would be impossible for you to make a difference just based on this photograph between a wall that shows, among other things, so a little door that covers probably the electricity, the fire extinguisher, a wall label that refers to I don't know what, this kind of emergency lighting, and the image of the sponsor, Volkswagen. You wouldn't be able to make a difference between a highly sophisticated post-conceptual installation, call it institutional critique, and just something that happens at an institution that cannot any longer control the space, because the boundaries between art and non-art have been blurred to a degree that it can be said that the ontological condition of art and art making has changed. This is due by the fact, I mean, that would be my thesis, but it's pretty obvious, by the emergence of the global transnational. Those kinds of juxtapositions, elective affinities or affective analogies, can be explored in exhibition making. But again, they cannot be programmed. For one person, this juxtaposition would work. Another person would be left speechless. On the left, on the pedestal, you have a sculpture by the American minimalist John McCracken. So this is a pink cube. It's lacquered and and creates a completely immaculate surface appearance. So it's like a fetish. And McCracken thought that he would communicating through this object with extraterrestrial life. It was basically one of the key questions he posed to me when Ruth and I were inviting him to Documenta if I believe in UFOs. As a European rationalist, I couldn't say no. But I also couldn't say yes. But Ruth said that the opposite hasn't been proven yet, and this saved our curatorial neck. On the right photograph, on the right you have a photograph of Graciela Carnevale and the and a group of avant-garde artists from Argentina who in '69 decided to leave the institutional system. And they did a performance in Cordoba in '69 where they invited artsy people like you to attend a gallery opening. The gallery was an empty space, and when the space was crowded with people, they shut the door and threw away the key, waiting for the people to smash the big shop window and to get out. But of course, I mean, the art audience was too timid, so it needed a passerby to throw a stone from the street through the window, and then people could escape. If you see only the left piece, then you would have the white cube in its pure form. If you see only the photograph on the right, then you would have another sad document of a once heroic performance. But the two together, elective affinities, do something to each other. Basically, you leave the institutional space in order to enter it on another level. Those kinds of juxtapositions or montage are not just a curatorial ploy. They are actually characteristic for quite a few artworks or artifacts, or however you want to name those things. This was the earliest piece we included in Documenta. It's a tiny drawing. I mean, not about A5 size. That was done by a Persian draftsman who must have accompanied a Persian prince to the Chinese emperor. And during those envoys, I mean, people were always ruthlessly documenting what was going on or what was particular in foreign countries. And this draftsman came up with this Persian landscape through which you see a Chinese river flowing. And then you also have this very strange rendering of Chinese rocks. So this is probably 15th, 16th century. Those are things you couldn't easily place in the type of encyclopedic museum for which the British Museum is my prime example. Because the European or the colonial order depended on very clear boundaries between room 71 and between room 72. But with things like this, ordering becomes a challenge. Is this Persian? Is it Chinese? Is it something else? So far, I have been looking at artifacts, but the way things are embedded matters. There's a white cube, yes. There's a Wunderkammer, the Cabinet de Curiosité. Both are risky options. And then, which is a rather new phenomenon, is a boutique-style museum or gallery. I mean, this is one example of Fondazione Prada, which is a space, the ideological function of which is to emphasize the object as a commodity. So you don't have to be a genius to discern how the language of commodity display is attuned here to the presentation of classical sculpture. This, on the other hand, is a shot of this tiny museum in Zurich, which I just mentioned. And usually I'm not into bragging, about my things, but it matters to me to show you a little bit how a different experimental methodology could look like or work. On the left, you have an image of a wire. But this is not any wire. This is a wire from the wire recorder on which the avant-garde filmmaker Maya Deren, she was born in Ukraine in 1917 and died in New York in 1961, recorded the sounds of voodoo rituals in Haiti. On the right, you have 16mm film material by Maya Deren. Deren is a good example of a transcultural passenger, of someone who defies the order of the encyclopedic museum. She's constantly passing from one room to the other, and you wouldn't know how to find her and where. She went to Haiti in order to study dance forms. But while in Haiti, she realized how complex the reality of this former French colony was. And after filming for months and coming home with about 6 hours of filmed footage and wire recordings, she gave up this project. Since then, the material lies slumbering at Anthology Film Archive. What you have on the right is a still image from a tiny sequence that was recently restored. And it shows a dancer performing a dance for her and for the camera. Darren's work is rooted, on the one hand, in a radically artistic perspective, but it's also informed by a scientific perspective, that of visual anthropology. She drew heavily on resources by Margaret Mead, Gregory Bateson, and others. So this is a kind of material that defies any easy categorization. Is this ethnography? Is this art? And its value, I think, for future thinking depends precisely on its resistance or on its negativity. I mean, to reintroduce this term I mentioned in the beginning of this material. So therefore we have a responsibility to restore it and make it accessible. But this is easier said than done. Because filming is only part of the process. The other part, equally important, is editing, the way you put your material together. This is a kind of virtue or artistic discipline Darren has demonstrated in abundance in her other movies, Measures of the Afternoon, which she did with Alexander Hammett, or Meditation on Violence, or whatever you know or might find on Maya Darren in the internet or wherever. So how can we restore, besides of the physical material, how can we restore the idea? There's no way, right? And this is where curatorial work proper starts, where you are faced with a dilemma that you cannot solve. So the proposition would be to accept the unfinished status of this material and to show what is lacking and turn this experience of lack into the experience of the visitor of the exhibition. So to finish this argument on Darren, I want to draw your attention to this voodoo flag, which shows a sort of Black Madonna, a ghost or a goddess, Erzulidantor, which actually started or helped to start the revolution that enabled the Haitians to liberate themselves from their French oppressors in 1791. This was the first colony, if we don't count the US, that liberated itself from its colonizers. It was a colony that had made France rich. 40% of world sugar production at the time came from Haiti, and 60% of world coffee production. So this was a cash cow that financed Versailles and other things. This is a history Europeans tend not to know. And the same goes for Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and so on and so forth. But I think it's a history that needs to be told and brought up. Because this historical understanding is key to any kind of understanding of the global complexity we are facing. The other Madonna is a Madonna from Częstochowa. So this is the Polish national icon. It was brought to Haiti by Polish mercenaries, which were sent by Napoleon in 1804 to reconquer the island. But for several reasons, and this is really a long story, the Haitians were stronger, and the Polish changed sides. This is why you still have Polish communities on Haiti. And there's one remarkable feature in the Black Madonna of Częstochowa. Those scars. I mean, they are the result of some kind of iconoclastic hacking that befell the Madonna in the 15th century. But this is a feature, and you have to believe me now, that actually entered the popular visual mythology of Haiti. So on Haitian soil, the Black Madonna from Częstochowa became really a Black Madonna. I mean, those are the kinds of objects that also defy the notion of an object, because what is happening here is transitory. You are not faced with a piece, but with a constellation. And this is also an effect of the ontological change in art that I had mentioned in the beginning. That the single artwork doesn't exist any longer. What you have is a kind of distributive unity. This is a term coined by Kant, but again, I got it from my philosopher friend, Peter Osborne. And this is also the point where an artwork understood in terms of distributive unity and an exhibition become one and the same. But again, I mean, to whom would it matter? Thank you.
Есть ли у вас вопросы?
позволю себе первым задать вопрос. Огромное спасибо, Рогер, за завораживающее выступление, которое является собой не столько лекцию, сколько то, что сейчас принято называть перформативная речь. Это был полуперформанс, полуконцептуальное выступление. Я очень благодарен, потому что то, что сегодня Рогер нам рассказал, это действительно было концептуальное обоснование того, что он сейчас делает в своем музее в Цюрихе. И ретроспективно это очень многое объяснило мне в его понимании, точнее в том, что он вкладывал в свой проект в Касселе. Тогда, если можно очень схематизировать, но полемика вокруг этого проекта свелась к тому, что, собственно говоря, в тот момент в художественном мире произошел некоторый раскол. Часть художников узнала себя в политической активности, сформировался на тот момент очень сильный интернациональный круг художников, политических активистов, и это было, собственно говоря, это же происходило и на московской художественной сцене, а часть художников, сохраняя интерес и чувствуя свою причастность к социальным и политическим проблемам, тем не менее настаивали на художественной автономии, настаивали на том, что те или иные идеи, та или иная позиция художника должна неизменно выражаться через верность художественному языку как таковому. И вот сейчас ретроспективно я бы хотел задать. Да, и, кстати говоря, вот как раз именно из лагеря политических активистов и их сподвижников, критиков, теоретиков, собственно говоря, и раздавалась большая часть критических ремарок в адрес проекта «Документы» Рогера Бюргеля и его группы. И выбирая, кстати говоря, художников из Москвы, он пригласил туда и вот Толю Осмоловского, он пригласил туда и Дмитрия Гутова, то есть тех художников, которые как раз очень настойчиво тогда на московской художественной сцене отстаивали именно идею автономии искусства как ресурса политической активности или реализации политической позиции, политических идей. Ну и тогда вот Толя Смоловский опубликовал в художественном журнале «Текст. Этический код автономии», кажется, я не путаюсь названием, который потом, кстати, был переведен нами на английский язык и издан в дайджесте английского языка, который затем был использован журнальным проектом «Документы» Рогера и его коллегой Георгием Шульхаймером, который вел тогда журнальный проект. Вот в очень большой степени сегодняшнее выступление многое прояснило мне в том, как понимал этот круг проблем Рогер Бюргель тогда, когда готовил, не только сегодня, но и тогда, когда готовил документу. И тем не менее сейчас, как мне кажется, сегодня вот в нашем контексте, общественном и художественном контексте, российском, но и, впрочем, уже и безусловно интернациональном, проблема политического и позиции художника по отношению к политическому контексту, общественному контексту вновь обретает остроту. И это совершенно очевидно. И уже целый ряд критических ремарок, в частности, в адрес своей выставки, я как раз получил именно из этого, так сказать, лагеря. Выставка кажется слишком отрешенной, слишком созерцательной, слишком хрупкой перед лицом вот тех серьезных проблем, которые встают поставленной сегодняшней повесткой дня, общественной и политической повесткой дня. Поэтому вот я позволил себе такой развернутый рассказ именно потому, что он проясняет немножко, как фигура Рогера Бюргеля и его проект считывался в московском художественном контексте, когда он в какой-то мере стал частью этого контекста. Да? И сейчас ретроспективно, по проходе вот многих лет, я, может быть, позволю себе задать вопрос, который вот призывает Рогера, может быть, более лапидарно и более лапидарно и программно высказать его понимание реализации политического в художественном контексте и в кураторской практике.
I think it's impossible to claim the political for your own work. If you are lucky, the political can be an effect. But I think what's, in my view, more important than this overused concept of the political is to cultivate your resistance or your hatred against society. I think that this is an important source to be strongly against something in order to develop ways of interacting with what is around you in a productive way, and also of taking others with you.
Ну, у меня вопрос такого характера. Ну, вот уже Виктор Мизяна говорил, что документа 12-е подверглась такой достаточно жесткой критике. Я, безусловно, лицо заинтересованное, и моя оценка была, что это была совершенно выдающаяся выставка. И вопрос мой, собственно, сводится к следующему. Со временем эта критика была каким-то образом скорректирована? То есть, вот, например, в данный момент существует какое-то иное мнение? Кто-то увидел в этой выставке, в том, скажем так, пути, который был вами показан, кто-то увидел продолжение, да, кто-то увидел в современности ростки этой, собственно, документы 12. Вот у меня какой вопрос.
I'm probably the wrong person to ask. Because, I mean, like the betrayed husband, I mean, I would be the last to know, right? But, I mean, I think I'm ambiguous about this question of criticism. I mean, first, we really made a huge effort to alienate almost everyone. So the passionate response that was provoked by this kind of snobbery, I mean, even though it had a political purpose, but not explicitly stated, because then it would have been vulgar. I mean, this kind of passionate response was necessary. And on the one hand, I mean, you are asking yourself, oh, mon Dieu, I mean, why I am doing this? But on the other hand, if you understand the origins of Documenta, an exhibition that was conceived in Germany in 1955 as a response to the German state crime of the 30s and 40s, I mean, then you cannot do an art fair, right? No way. I mean, you have to look for angles that would cause the most damage to business as usual. This is also a kind of ethical obligation you have. But on the other hand, I mean, we always had friends and collaborators. I mean, I never felt alone. And those people I admire in the art world, I have to say. I mean, never voiced their concern about the exhibitions. They were skeptical in some regards, and so were we. We also made many mistakes, because an exhibition of this scale is also kind of trial and error. Some things go surprisingly well, where you wouldn't have expected it, and others fail miserably. It happens, right? And but it doesn't change the consistency or texture of the argument. So, and this is important. And for me still, I mean, this kind of passionate response is very important. And it gave me, also it was psychically difficult. It also gave me a lot of power, actually. But on the, I mean, but to answer your question, Tolja, more directly, yeah, I think people slowly get it.
Расскажите, пожалуйста, о вашем музее кофейной культуры. Я так поняла, что это последняя инсталляция с двумя Мадоннами. Это же временная экспозиция в нем. Как он зародился, какова его идея и будущие планы?
This is an unfair question. Because to answer it would take another week. First, the Johann Jacobs Museum was a coffee museum. It no longer is. And this Mayaderen exhibition is now on display. It is an exhibition that explains why it is necessary to restore the Haitian footage of Darren and what the dilemma will be with this footage. Because just restoring it is not sufficient. I can briefly give you another example of another type of exhibition, and then you might discern a pattern. We work with an anthropologist and an artist from Hong Kong, and their commission was to address the low end of global trade between Africa and China. they went to the Chungking Mansions in Hong Kong, which is a famous market, where African traders go with 3 months or 6 months visa. And they bring stuff from Africa, which is basically smuggled into Hong Kong. And they go home with mostly electronic equipment. There are economic reports that claim basically that around 80% of cell phones in sub-Saharan Africa come through Chungking Mansions. So this is a major hub. And they met a Somali guy, and they were attracted by him because he was, on the one hand, an asylum seeker in Hong Kong. But he was also making all kinds of deals. So he was selling rights on Somali gold mines to the Chinese business community in Hong Kong. And he was also importing heavy machinery, caterpillars and this kind of stuff you need for mining, into Somalia. But you can only bring unused equipment into Somalia. That's the law. So he buys vintage machinery from Japan and has his own factory in Guangdong that pimps up the machinery so that it looks new and gets it to Africa. And they were talking to this guy and were fascinated that an asylum seeker who has no work permit is doing actually those $1 million schemes. And he told them, oh, I'm not working. I mean, I'm just taking the phone and that's it. And then they got a call from him because HSBC had canceled his business account. And he needed, because he had so many deals in the air, he needed someone to set up a business account immediately. And he asked those two, the Hong Kong Chinese and the white woman, to do it for him. Because also Hong Kong is quite a liberal economy. They would never allow him, as a black man with an asylum status, to open a business bank account. And this was similar to Maya Deren and also to a dilemma ethnographers tend to face, a kind of threshold experience. Because they could have said, no, we like to talk to you and research you, but don't come too near. Or they could say, yes, we help you, knowing that this would forever tie them together. And they would never be able to distance themselves scientifically from their object. So they set up this bank account, and he owed them a favor. And they also realized while working with him that he had many business deals. For example, after Fukushima, the Chinese stopped importing abalone from the Japanese sea. Abalone are those snails, which are the foie gras equivalent in China. So they are grown in those shells. And he knew that there are a plenty of abalone on the coast of Somalia at the Horn of Africa. So he decided to teach Somali fishermen to go for abalone. For a crustacean, Africans would never touch. They called it the cockroaches of the sea. So he taught them with the help of Japanese diver manuals to extract abalone from the ocean and shipped it then to Hong Kong and made whole fishing community rich at the Horn of Africa. And of course, I mean, in Hong Kong, he sold the stuff for a fortune. And we wanted to, not just to show, to document, those kinds of trades that are basically the norm. It sounds like a fancy story, but this is what 98% of the business community are doing, those shady deals. We didn't want to document it, in this typical way with a bit of text and photographs and a sexy video and so on and so forth. But we tried to get into the deal. So what we did was to order 2 tons of those abalone shells to be sent via Djibouti and Dubai to Zurich, that would then migrate further to Guangdong province, where the mother of pearl is extracted from the shell, probably by child labor, and then sent back to Switzerland to Tag Heuer, Rolex, Patek Philippe, and similar companies. So we bought those 2 tons of shells and sold them 5 minutes later. And this was a huge logistic operation. And at some point, and this was the exhibition, those 2 tons of shells arrived in Zurich, in our tiny museums. And of course, stupid as I was, I didn't foresee how horribly they would smell. Our museum is housed in a beautiful bourgeois villa, very Swiss. And now you had this incredible stench, which is, of course, part of globalization. But this was also an interesting lesson to be learned, for the Swiss. That global trade is not primarily done by a mouse click.
Roger, thank you very much for your lecture. I wanted to ask, what is your curatorial choice for the themes and the materials is driven by? Because from the few examples you have shown, it seems that it's more situated in the field of post-colonial, decolonial, or maybe ethnological or anthropological studies. Or is it more driven by this spontaneous impression from an object that you talked about?
Yeah, fortunately, I don't have to decide. It makes no sense to have a kind of theoretical toolbox and then nothing to which it refers, right? And on the other hand, just looking at a voodoo flag, like the one with the Black Madonna, with Erzulidantur, without bringing up the story, wouldn't make much sense either. So it's both. Needs to be both. Has to come from both directions.
So, now do you live in Switzerland? Yes. And this presentation showed us that you're thinking about history, European history especially, and you realize your idea in general by filming photos, maybe some handmade things. And what do you think about some digital art, some media art, or new modern installation with new technologies? And have you seen maybe some places in Moscow with this art or in the world?
I have to apologize. I arrived only two hours ago. So my time in Moscow will start in perhaps half an hour. And but I can promise to you that I won't be lazy. Yeah, usually, I mean, those exhibitions are done in collaborations, like with Daisy Bizenix and Royce Eng. I mean, those two who are responsible for A Season in Shell, and also for its continuation. It's an ongoing project, because they recently found out that this concept of African development aid, mutual aid, derives from Peter Kropotkin, who in turn got it from Swiss watchmakers in the Jura. But I don't want to bore you, I mean, with all those silly stories. But just to answer this, your questions, the exhibitions, they come out of collaborations. And basically, I don't care what media artists choose. So, I mean, for myself, the term medium is obsolete. It has lost any meaning. And if someone, I mean, if an artist decides to work primarily in web-based formats or so, I'm fine, of course. And if someone chooses watercolors, okay.
Скажите, пожалуйста, вот в описании работы, когда вот именно было про продажу сахара, и за счет того, что эти плантации колониальные спонсировали Версаль и все остальное, ну, по сути, сейчас происходит то же самое. Какие-то плантации чая или кофе, они также обеспечивают ту же самую документу и те же самые там ярмарки искусства и весь этот сегодняшний рынок искусства. И в этой работе именно хотелось показать отсылки просто к истории или именно осмысление, рефлексия современного постколониального зависимого положения других стран. Спасибо.
I think it makes sense to make a difference between the way Documenta is financed and Versailles was financed. I mean, I agree that we are all implicated in a kind of system, and that a major exhibition of contemporary art that is financed by the German taxpayer. I mean, same with probably 60% of those logos. I mean, you have countries that are exporting arms and so on and so forth, and then it goes into cultural projects. I mean, this is all true. But the plantation economy in the 18th century was still different. I mean, average life expectancy of a slave working the plantation was about 6 years. This is why they had to ship millions of people from the African coast to Caribbean islands, as well as countries like Brazil and so on and so forth. No, for me, the key entry into all those things, I don't start from theory, also I read a lot. But it's not that I'm reading the latest post-colonial treatise and then I'm looking for the art to illustrate it. It's more that I'm fascinated by Darren, the artist, as someone who arrives with a modernist formation as a filmmaker, as a cinematographer, and encounters a non-modern reality. So this kind of conflict or formal challenge is what matters to me. So I tend to follow the way of the artist, so to speak.
Поблагодарим нашего гостя. Спасибо.
Yeah, thank you for your patience, and I also want to thank our translator, for her work.